Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud of Masechta Yoma, Daf 10. Agadata kind of stuff. A whole bunch of Agadata at the beginning. And then we get to an interesting machlokas, a three-way machlokas between Rabba, Abaye, and Rava about the Mezuza of the lishkas parhedrin in the Beis HaMikdash, which then gets us into a whole discussion about mezuzahs, which is going to take us really through tomorrow's daf as well. I can't tell you further than that, but we're going to start getting into sugyas about mezuzah. So anyways, that's what we have in store for today's daf. We're going to get started with this Agadatas. So we are at daf Tes Amud Beis at the bottom of the page. So what the last thing we had discussed was an interesting encounter between arguably Rish Lakish and Rebbe Lazar, where Rish Lakish and Rabbi Bar Bachana, where Rish Lakish accused or kind of blamed Rabbi Bar Bachana and said that the Eibishter hates him because Rabbi Bar Bachana was from Bavel, and the Babylonians only came back 50% during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. And for that reason, that's why we lost Nevuah, and we only get a bas kol. So now says the Gemara, that when Rish Lakish came to Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi Yechanan said that's not the reason. That the reason why there was no Nevuah in the second Beis HaMikdash has nothing to do with the fact that the Yidden stayed in Bavel. Even if all the Yidden would have come back to Eretz Yisrael for the Bayis Sheni during the days of Ezra, still there wouldn't be Nevuah in the second temple. The Pasuk says, that the Eibishter gives beauty to Yefes, but he really only dwells in the tents of shame. Even though the Eibishter gave much beauty to Yefes, and Yefes, as we're going to see, being the Persians, and the Persians essentially were the backers of the second temple, and it was a very beautiful temple. But even though Yefes, right? Yefes. Even though the Persian temple, the second temple, was a very beautiful temple, nonetheless, that the Eibishter nonetheless dwells in the tents of shame, i.e. in the first temple that was built by Shlomo HaMelech. So how do we know that the Persians come from Yefes, the son of Noach? The Pasuk says, Bnei Yefes, the children of Yefes, there are 7 of them. Gomer, Magog, Umadav Yavon, V'tuval Umeshech, V'siros. Okay? Gomer ze Germania, Magog ze Kandia, Madai ze Macedonia, Yavon Kimashmo. Okay? I'm not really, there's going to be a lot of these coming up, so a lot of places. I don't know. How do you guys want me to translate this? Gomer is Germania, Magog is Kandia, Madai is Macedonia, Yavon, is Greece. Alright? Weiter. Tuval ze Beis Onyaki, Meshech ze zo Mosia, and Tiras Pligi bar B'simai v'Rabbanan. Okay, so Tuval is Beis Onyaki, Meshech is Mosia. Now, Tiras is where it becomes interesting for us. Pligi bar B'simai v'Rabbanan. So this is Taka Machlekes of B'simai and the rabbis about what exactly is Tiras. Okay, what do you think it is? Don't say corn. Some say it was Reb Simon v'Rabbanan, that it wasn't Reb Simai, it was Reb Simon and the rabbis. Okay, Chad Omar zo beis Taryaki, some say it was Taka Teriyaki house, v'Chad Omar zo Paras. Boom. But this is where it ties into our Gemara, that one of them says that Tiras, who is the youngest child of Yefes, is Paras, is Persia. Tani, Rav Yosef, Tiras zo Paras. Rav Yosef taught that Tiras is in fact Persia, so that is how we know that Yafta Lokum Yefes is a reference to, or at least can be an allusion to, the second temple that was built by Daryavesh, the Persians. Savta v'Raima v'Savticha. These were what? These were the places that Nimrod, I think, ruled over. Oh no, I'm sorry. Uvnei Chush, the daughters of the children of Cush, Svava Chavila v'Savta v'Rama v'Savtacha uvnei Rama Shva u'Dedan. So we said that these were the children of Cush. They were Savta, Rama, and Savtacha. So Tani Rav Yosef, Skisosan, Gav Yoso, Skisosan, Bar Yoso. That Savta and Savtacha are really like the same kind of thing. One is the inner Skisan and the other one is the outer Skisan. Ben Chada l'Chada Mea Parse, between the inner Sakistan and the outer Sakistan is 100 parses. Vekefa Alpha Parse, and its circumference is Lemaise Alpha Elef 1,000 parses. But the Rashis Mamlachto Bavel, and it says, I think this is about Nimrod, right? That right at the beginning of his kingship was Bavel ve'erech ve'akad ve'chalne. So Bavel kimashma'o, Bavel is Bavel. Erech zo orichus ve'akad ze bashkar, kalne ze nofar. Okay, you can skip the next word. Sounds good to me. And from that land came Ashur. Tani Rav Yosef, Ashur is a sea lake. Alright, Ashur is sea lake. Even as Ninveh, Ves Rechovos, Ir, Ves Kalach, and he built, I think it's still referring to Nimrod, that he built Ninveh, Rechovos, Ir, and Kalach. Ninveh Kimashmo, okay, so Ninveh is Ninveh, okay, like from Yona on Yom Kippur. Rechovos, Ir, Zo Pras de Mishon, Kalach, Zo Pras de Borsif. Sounds good to me. Ves Resen, Ve Ninveh, Ven Kalach. And Resen was between Ninveh and Kalach. Here, Ir Agadola. It's the big city. We're going to see in a second what's the big city. Resen ze Aktifon. Resen is Aktifon. Great. Here, Ir Agadola, when it says that it is the big city, En Yodeh, Im Ninveh Ir Agadola, Im Resen Ir Agadola. So which is the big city? Is it saying Ninveh is the big city or Resen is the big city? Well, Kshu Omer, V'Ninveh Aisi Ir Agadola, L'Kim Alech Shloshis Yomim. So when it says in Sefer Yona, that Ninveh was a really big city, yet it took 3 days to walk from one end to the other end. Haviyomer Ninveh Ir Gedola. So then, if we had to bet, so then Mistama, it is Ninveh that is the large city, because we see in Sefer Yonah that it is described as a very large city. Visham and Darin Achiman, right? This is from when the Meraglim went to Eretz Yisrael. And it says that they went until Hebron, and it says, Visham Darin, Achiman Shesha V'Talmai. There lived Achiman Shesha and Talmai, Yelidia Anak, the children of the giants, and we're going to see in a second a different drash that we could say about the Yelidia Anak. Tane, it was taught Achiman Miyuman Sheba Achim, that Achiman was the strongest of the brothers. Sheshai, Shemesim Esaretz Kshchisais. Sheshai is that when he walks, he like destroys the earth. He's like so powerful, so forceful that he like destroys the earth when he walks. Tamai shemesim is arts tlum. Tamai, that when he walks, he makes like furrows in the ground. All right, skip the next two words. Achimon bana Anas. Achimon built Anas. Sheshai bana Alush. Sheshai built a place called Alush. So next time you go to Alush, you remember this Gemara and you'll think, Sheshai. Talmai bana Talbush. Okay, when you go to Talbush, you'll know that Talmai was the original builder. Yelidia Anak. What does it mean that they were the children of the Anak, of the giant? So you can also, like Anak is like also like a what's it called? A necklace, I believe. Shemanikin Acham v'Komoson, that they would basically like, they were so tall that like the sun was like a necklace for them. All right. Amar Yoshua ben Levi. It says Yoshua ben Levi, Amar Rebbe, in the name of Rebbe. I see the Rome Shatipo Biad Paris, that in the future Rome is going to fall in the hands of Persia. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Lochin Shimu Atzas Hashem. Therefore, listen to the advice of God, Asher Yoatz El Edom, that he advised towards Edom, Machshavosav, and his thoughts, Asher Chashav El Yoshvei Teman, that he thought towards the dwellers of Teman. Imlo Yech, oh man, I keep on forgetting the Yischavum, I think. Imlo Yischavum Tzeirei Atzon, if the young of the tzon, of the sheep, are going to drag them and chop them, if they will not overturn upon them their houses. All right, and that Tzeirei Atzon, these young sheep, is a reference to the Persians. All right, so basically the Persians are going to wipe the floor with the Romans. All right, sounds interesting. Maskeflo Rabbi Bar Ula. Rabbi Bar Ula asked a kasha. My mashma da'id tzi'irei atzon parasu. How do you know that these tzi'irei atzon is a reference to Persia, to say that Persia is going to have this crazy conquest and success? Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, ha'ayel asher ra'isa ba'ala kronayim malchim oda yufaris. Is it because the pasuk in Daniel says that he saw in a dream that there was a ram with these horns, and that was a reference to Madai and Para? So we want to argue that Persia is therefore these tzi'irei atzon, is a reference to these sheep. I'll say that maybe it's a reference to, maybe these young sheep is a reference to Yavon. As the pasuk says, the very following pasuk says, "Vatzfir Asayir Melech Yavon," that this he-goat was the king of Greece, and like a flock could be referring to sheep, goats. So therefore, maybe it's Taka Greece is going to be this very victorious nation. Kisalik Rav Chaviva bar Surmaki. So when Rav Chaviva bar Surmaki went to Eretz Yisrael, so he said this in front of this rabbi. How do you know that Rome is going to fall in the hands of Persia? Maybe Taka, Rome is going to fall in the hands of Greece. Omerle, to which the rabbi said, right, and Rabbi Bar Ula was asking this as a kasha on Rebbe, right? Rabbi Shua ben Levi said in the name of Rebbe that in the future Rome is going to fall to the Persians. Rabbi Bar Ula says, how does he know that this Tzirei Atzon is a reference to the Persians? Maybe it's the Greeks. So Omerle, so this rabbi in Eretz Yisrael said to Rav Chaviva bar Surmaki, Mandelo Yoda Perushay Kroi Mosef Tuv to Rebbe. Somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about is asking a kasha against Rebbe. My Tzirei Atzon, what does it mean, the young of the sheep? Zutru Da'achori, it means the youngest of the brothers. Think back to the children of Yefes. We had the 7 children of Yefes, and the last one was Tiras. Tiras is Persia. Persia is the youngest, is this Tzirei Atzon. Right, Tzirei Atzon means the youngest of the brothers. The Tanya of Yosef is of Yosef taught Tiras Zeparos, that Tiras, the youngest child of Yefes, is a reference to Persia. Amr Rabbi Bar Bachana, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Yehuda Rabbi Loi, Asida Rome Mishatipo Biad Paros, that in the future Rome is going to fall in the hands of Persia. Kalva Chomer. It's logical. You can make an argument to conclude thus. Ma Mikdash Rishon Shebna'u B'nei Shem, V'echrivu Kazdim V'noflu Kazdim Biad Parsim. You have the Mikdash Rishon, right? The first base of Mikdash. Shebna'u b'nei Shem, that was built by the children of Shem. V'echrivu Kasdim, and then it was destroyed by the Kasdim. Naflu Kasdim biad Parsim, and the Persians conquered and defeated the Kasdim. So basically, the first temple wasn't built by the Persians, and yet the Persians defeated ultimately the destroyers of the first temple. Mikdasheni shebnu Parsim, the second base of Mikdash that the Persians Kilu were involved in building it. V'echrivu Romim, and it was destroyed by the Romans. Certainly, enodin sheyiplu Romim biad Parsim. Certainly, the Persians are going to defeat them. Right? If the Persians even defeated these people that destroyed a base of Mikdash that they weren't involved in, certainly they're going to destroy this nation that essentially destroyed their handiwork. Rav, see the parish shetipo biyad Romi. Says Rav that Lemaisa in the future Persia is going to fall in the hands of the Romans. Amrulei Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi l'Rav. I don't know if I said Rav, but I meant Rav. So said Rav Kahana and Rav Asi to Rav. Now Rav Kahana and Rav Asi, we learned in Masechta Shabbos, I believe that they were Talmud Chovers of Rav. Banuye biyad Sasure, says Rav Kahana and Rav Asi to Rav. How could it be that builders are going to fall in the hands of destroyers? Isn't that cool? Like there's a certain assumption that like positive energy can't lose out to negative energy. How could it possibly be that the Persians, these builders, are going to lose to these Romans who are destroyers? Armlu in Gezeres Melechi, Rav says, yeah, you're right in theory, but the fact of the matter is it's a decree from God that this is what's going to be, that the builders are going to fall in the hands of the destroyers. Those who say Amar Luhu, that Rav said to them, Inunami hakosase be knishta uwa. But even the Persians, they also do their fair share of destroying. They destroy synagogues. Tananami Achi, also in a brisa like this, I'll see the parashat people biad Romi, that in the future Persia is going to fall in the hands of Rome. Chalad desase be knishta. Firstly, because they destroy synagogues, and also it is a decree of the king that the builders will fall in the hands of the destroyers. The Amar of Yehuda, Amar Rav, says Rav Yehuda in the name Rav, Ein Ben David Ba that Mashiach ben David is not going to come until Rome spreads out across the entire world, Tisha Chodashim, for 9 months. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Lachin yitnem areis yoleda yalada, that I will give them like tsaris, struggles, pain, like a woman who's giving birth. And that's the reference to the 9 months. And then the rest of the brothers, whoever's left over from Gog and Magog, they will come and join the Yidden. Alright, so what do you guys think? You think that Rome is going to fall in the hands of the Persians, or that Persia is going to fall in the hands of the Romans? What do you guys think? Okay, so now we get to this three-way machlokes regarding the mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin in the Beis HaMikdash. So let's see. All of the offices that they had in the Beis HaMikdash, they didn't have mezuzahs. Interesting. They didn't have office, and we're going to learn about this on Daf Yud Aleph Mud Beis, I believe. That all of the offices in the Beis HaMikdash did not have mezuzah. There was one exception. Chutz milishkas parhedrin shayaba beis dira l'kohen gadol. The exception being the lishkas parhedrin, which of course we know the Kohen Gadol quarantined in for 7 days before Yom Kippur. That was the exception. The lishkas parhedrin had a mezuzah. That's where the Kohen Gadol lived for a week. Rabbi Yehuda, says Rabbi Yehuda, says Rabbi Yehuda, 1 second, there's lots of offices in the Beis HaMikdash that had a place for people to live, and yet they didn't have a mezuzah. So rather, says Rabbi Yehuda, that the reason for the lishkas parhedrin, why there was a mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin, is not because it was a living space. It was for some other reason. As we're going to learn at the end of the daf, we'll get there at the end of the daf. Let's just say for some other gezerah. There's some other technical reason why the lishkas parhedrin has a mezuzah, but it's not because it's a house. My time with Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara wants to know, how come Rabbi Yehuda doesn't want to consider the lishkas parhedrin to be a house? Amar Rabba, says Rabba, Kasav Rabbi Yehuda, Kobay Sheinu Asu Limos HaChamim V'Limos HaGeshavim Beino Bayis. Because Rabbi Yehuda holds, says Rabba, that any house that is not for the summer and the winter is not considered a house. Now this is for 1 week. The Kohen Gadol lives there for 1 week. So therefore, it's not going to be chayiv in a mezuzah. Okay? Eis ve'abai. But Abai asks a kasha on Rabba. V'yoksiv, but the pasuk says, V'ikesi, beis hachoriv al beis hakayetz, that I will smite the house of the winter on the house of the kayetz. So we see that it's called a beis hachoriv and beis hakayetz. It's called the house of the winter and the house of the summer. So we see that even a seasonal house is considered a house. So, Rabbi, why are you saying that according to Rabbi Yehuda it would have to be, a 1 week house is not enough, it needs to be winter and summer? Apparently the pasuk seems to be calling a house, even if it's just a winter house or just a summer house, it's called a house. Says Rabbi, no. Yeah, it's called a beis kai, it's a beis chorif. You wouldn't consider it a house. You'd call it a summer house, a winter house, but not a plain house. For it to be chayiv in mezuzah, Rabbi Yehuda would hold that it has to be just a plain house, and for that it would have to be for the summer and the winter. That's what Rabbi wants to argue. Eis ve'abaye. Abaye says, it cannot be that Rabbi Yehuda holds that in order for something to be considered a house, it has to be summer and winter, because sukkah achag b'chag, that when it comes to a sukkah, on sukkahs, Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv v'chacham poter, Rabbi Yehuda says it's takachayiv in a mezuzah. Chacham say poter. V'tani alam, we taught about it, Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv be'erev of mezuzah of meiser. That when Rabbi Yehuda says chayiv, it means chayiv in erev. So if you have like a chotzer and you have sukkahs in the chotzer, of course we know all about Masech Eruvin, which by the way, I remember at one point, I think it must have been in the middle of Masech Eruvin, I said it's crazy how from Shabbos throughout Eruvin, all we could talk about is Eruvs, and it felt like it was never going to end. At this point, when's the last time you thought about Eruvin? There's been so much since then, from Psachim and Shkalim and now Yoma. We're not going to get to it again until the end of... the truth is in Sukkah it comes up, but it's interesting how for so long it felt like all Gemara was Eruvin. But it ended and we went weiter, Anyways, so although Shtikl Erevin is going to come up, what's it, tomorrow? Anyways, so when it comes to Erev, and at least now we know enough Erevin that we can see a Gemara like this, and like we know what it's talking about. So if you have a Chatzar and you have some Sukkahs in there, so a Sukkah is enough to consider to be Chayiv in Erev, and whatever nafkamin is there would be in terms of a house and a Chatzar. Uva Mezuza, it's Taka Chayiv in a Mezuza. You put a Mezuza in the Sukkah. Uva Meiser as well as Meiser, right? Part of the halachas of Meiser is that if you take Meiser into your house, right, meaning that roe pnei abayis, once you kind of take your food and you bring it into your house, at that point it's going to be chayiv and meiser. So the same thing applies to a sukkah. So if you take your produce into your sukkah, so that's considered like you brought it into your house, and now it's going to be chayiv in meiser. So now says the Gemara, and if you're going to say, well, when Rabbi Yehuda says it's chayiv, it means only midar abanon, but really meikar adin, it's not considered a house, and it wouldn't really be chayiv in eruv and mezuzah. Right, so b'shlama eruv and mezuzah, so you can get away with saying that it's midar abanon when it comes to eruv and mezuzah because there's no harm there. But how can you say that once you take your produce into your sukkah, it's going to be chayiv and meiser midar abanon? It's going to come to create a mess. But now what's going to happen is it's going to create a big mess because you're going to have some things that are going to be chayiv midoraisa in meiser, right? Maybe you're going to have some tevel with you, and then you're going to have some of this meiser that's only chayiv midorabanan because you brought it into the sukkah. And now you're going to say, okay, well, I have all this produce and I have to separate meiser, and now you're going to like separate meiser. Let's say you end up separating meiser from the midorabanan stuff, and you think that with that you covered the midoraisa stuff. It's going to create a big mess. So you can't just say that it's chayiv meiser midorabanan. So rather, it must be that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sukkah, which you're only using for 1 week a year, is enough to be chayiv. So when we say it's chayiv in eruv and mezuzah and meiser, it means midoraisa. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that even a sukkah is chayiv mezuzah midoraisa. So clearly, Rabba's argument that Rabbi Yehuda only considers it a house to be chayiv in mezuzah if you use it for winter and summer is not correct according to Abai. According to this proof, Elamar Abai. So Abai gives his own approach, which is b'shivadu chuli amalu pliga de mechayva. Okay, so rather says Abaye that everyone agrees that the lishkas parhedrin is chayiv to have mezuzah for 7 days. For 7 days. Of course, Rabbi Yehuda says that even a sukkah is chayiv in a mezuzah. Even a sukkah is chayiv in a mezuzah, and therefore the lishkas parhedrin for those 7 days that the Kohen Gadol is living in it is going to be chayiv to have a mezuzah. When he says, however, ki plige, when Rabbi Yehuda argues and says that, well, the lishkas parhedrin, it's not about, it's not a living space that should be chayiv in a mezuzah, b'shar yemos hashana is the rest of the days of the year. Rabbanan savi gazvinan shar yemos hashana atu shiva, Rabbi Yehuda savi lo gazvinan. Whereas the rabbis say, well, since we are going to have a mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin for those 7 days of the year when the Kohen Gadol is living there, so therefore we're going to have a mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin for the entire year. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you're going to have a mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin during the week that the Kohen Gadol is quarantining there, just like you would have a mezuzah in your sukkah the week that you're living there for sukkahs. But after the Kohen Gadol is done in the lishkas parhedrin, then we can take down the mezuzah. Now, frekt Rava Akasha, Amalei Rava says Tabayi, Basuk is a chag b'chag katani. But 1 second, meaning what did Abayi say? Abayi said that everyone agrees that for the 7 days that the Kohen Gadol is quarantining, there's going to be a mezuzah, because even Rabbi Yehuda would say that in a sukkah needs a mezuzah. So even Rabbi Yehuda would say that the lishkas parhedrin would also need a mezuzah when the Kohen Gadol is quarantining there. Rava points out a great kasha. Sure, Rabbi Yehuda says that a sukkah requires a mezuzah, but guess what? It's a machlokas, right? We just said sukkah's a chag b'chag. Rabbi Yehuda mechayv b'chacham potrim. The chacham say it's potter from a mezuzah, and therefore don't say that the chacham that both Rabbi Yehuda and the chacham agree that during the 7 days of quarantine the lishkas parhedrin is chayiv mezuzah, and then according to the Chacham, they say that we're going to now make to keep the mezuzah up for the entire year because of those 7 days. Guess what? The Chacham say that during the 7 days of Sukkot, you don't need a mezuzah, and therefore I would argue, says Rava, that if it's based on like the Sukkah argument, and then the rest of the year is just based on the fact that we need the mezuzah for those 7 days, guess what? The Chacham say that a Sukkah doesn't need a mezuzah, and therefore I'll argue that if this was the case, then the Chacham would say that the lishkas parhedrin for the 7 days of quarantine also doesn't need a sukkah, a mezuzah, and therefore there would be no reason to say that the rest of the year it should require a mezuzah because of those 7 days. Ela Rava, says Rava, rather, everyone agrees that for the rest of the days of the year, outside of the 7 days of quarantine, the lishkas parhedrin does not require a mezuzah. Ki plige, where there's a machlokes, is actually beshiva, is regarding those 7 days. That the Rabbanan say that we consider it to be a dira, a house, a living space, and that's why it needs a mezuzah. Rabbi Yehuda says no, for those 7 days of quarantine, it is not considered a living space. And don't worry about sukkah. We'll get there in a second. But says Rabbi Yehuda, for those 7 days, it is not considered a living space. So again, everyone agrees that outside of those 7 days, you don't have to worry about a mezuzah. It's part of a mezuzah. But during those 7 days of quarantine, the Chachamim say that the lishkas parhedrin is considered a house, and it requires a mezuzah. Rabbi Yehuda says that it doesn't require a mezuzah. The only reason why we do put up a mezuzah is for some other concern that we'll get to in a few minutes. V'sukkah time l'chud, v'lishka time l'chud. I don't know if I skipped a few words. Right? Kiplige b'shiva. They argue about the 7 days of quarantine. V'sukkah time l'chud, v'lishka time l'chud. And if you're going to say, wait, but I thought Rabbi Yehuda says that a sukkah for a week requires a mezuzah. Certainly, then the lishkas parhedrin in the Beis Hamikdash for the week of quarantine should require a mezuzah. Not so. V'sukkah time l'chud, v'lishka time l'chud. Apples and oranges. The reason why a sukkah requires a mezuzah is no reason to say that the lishkas parhedrin should require a sukkah for the 7 days of quarantine. Sukkah time l'chud, Rabbi Yehuda the time edam sukkah dir askeva ba'inun mechayva b'mezuzah. The reason why Rabbi Yehuda says that a sukkah requires a mezuzah is because Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, as we're going to see in Masech the Sukkah, is that a sukkah has to be a dir askeva. That a sukkah needs to be a proper structure, and because it's a proper structure, so it requires a mezuzah. Whereas the Chacham argue and say, no, the sukkah needs to be a temporary structure. And because it's a temporary structure, that's why you don't put up a mezuzah. So the machlokas about sukkah is about a temporary structure versus a kavua structure. The lishka, time of the chud, and when it comes to the lishkas parhedrin, does it require a mezuzah for the 7 days of quarantine? It's a completely different machlokas. Rabbanan savedira bal korcha shmadira, Rabbi Yehuda savedira bal korcha lo shmadira. The rabbis say when you have to live somewhere against your will, such as the Kohen Gadol quarantining for 7 days, whether he likes it or not, before Yom Kippur, is that considered living there or not? According to the Chacham, say yes, it is considered living there, and therefore the lishkas parhedrin is going to be chayiv in a mezuzah for those 7 days. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's not considered living there, and therefore the lishkas parhedrin is going to be pater from a mezuzah for those 7 days. Now, now the moment everybody's been waiting for. So what's this mysterious gezerah? What's this reason then why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we have a mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin for the 7 days of quarantine? Because after all, Rabbi Yehuda says it's not considered a house, a living space. The answer is because we don't want anybody to think that we're forcing the Kohen Gadol into this room and we're locking him in a room in jail essentially for 7 days. We don't want anybody to think that. So therefore we put up a mezuzah to make it clear that this is a living space. It's not a jail, right? If there wouldn't be a mezuzah, so then it would be it would look like a jail. So we put up a mezuzah to make it clear that it's a living space. We're not forcing anybody to be in jail. All right. But me'ikar adin, says Rabbi Yehuda, dir bal korcha lo shmadira, and therefore would be pater from a mezuzah. Mantana l'adutanu rabbanon, who is the teacher who taught the following brayso called Shairim Shayusham, all of the gates that were in the Beis Hamikdash loy mezuzah, they did not have a mezuzah chutz mishar Nikanor, the exception being the gate of Nikanor, Shelifnim mimenu lishkas parhedrin, that inner more than that was the office of the parhedrin. So we're saying that Shar Nicanor had a mezuzah because further in was the lishkas parhedrin. So we see that the lishkas parhedrin being chayiv in a mezuzah is the reason for Shar Nicanor to have a mezuzah. So lema rabbanan v'lo Rabbi Yehuda. Let's say that is the rabbis and not Rabbi Yehuda, because if it was Rabbi Yehuda, he gufo gzera v'ananekum v'nigzor gzera l'gzera. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the whole reason why the lishkas parhedrin has a mezuzah is only a gezerah, so that nobody should think that the Kohen Gadol is in jail. So, if the only reason why lishkas parhedrin has a mezuzah as a gezerah, we're now going to say that in addition to that, we're also going to put a mezuzah on Shar Nicanor, because within Shar Nicanor is the lishkas parhedrin, which has a mezuzah, which is only there for a gezerah. We're going to make a gezerah and a gezerah to say that therefore also Shar Nicanor needs to have a gezerah. No, a mezuzah. No, therefore it must be the rabbis who say that because the lishkas parhedrin requires a mezuzah, meikar adin, because the Kohen Gadol is living there, so therefore also the Shar Nicanor, where the lishkas parhedrin is more inner more than the Shar Nicanor, so the Shar Nicanor also has a mezuzah. All right. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda kula chad gezeri. And the Gemara says, actually, you can even say that maybe this Bryce says Rabbi Yehuda, because you could say it's all the same the gezerah. That when we say that, we put up a mezuzah so that it doesn't look like the Kohen Gadol, we're like forcing him into a jail, so to speak. So we put up a mezuzah on lishkas parhedrin, and part of that as well is putting one up on the Shar Nicanor. Okay. That was daf Yud of Masechta Eruvin. I hope you enjoyed it. The beginning was just sort of like interesting Agadatas about the different geography of different places, and then this discussion about will Rome fall in the hands of the Persians or will the Persians fall in the hands of the Romans? All right. Then we got into this machlokas regarding mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin. Right, the Chacham say that the Kohen Gadol that there was a mezuzah in the lishkas parhedrin because the Kohen Gadol lives in the lishkas parhedrin for a week. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that's not the reason why there's a mezuzah on the lishkas parhedrin. Really, you don't need a mezuzah on the lishkas parhedrin. The only reason why we have it is out of concern that we don't want anybody to think that we're forcing the Kohen Gadol into like a jail, so to speak. So we put a mezuzah on the door so that it looks a little more inviting, it looks like a home. So the question is, why does Rabbi Yehuda not consider the lishkas parhedrin to be a living space? Rabbah says, well, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, in order for it to be a living space, it would have to be a space that you live in for summer and winter. This is only for a week. Says Abai, come on. Rabbi Yehuda says you have to put up a mezuzah on your sukkah that you live in for a week. He considers that to be a living space. So then certainly, certainly he doesn't require something to a living space doesn't define a living space as a place that you have to live in summer and winter. So rather, Abaye says that everyone agrees that during the week that the Kohen Gadol is quarantining there, the lishkas parhedrin has to have a mezuzah. Because even Rabbi Yehuda says that during the week of Sukkot you need a mezuzah, so certainly the lishkas parhedrin for the week of quarantine requires a mezuzah. The machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan is the rest of the year. The rabbis say that just like during those 7 days there's a mezuzah, so also there's a mezuzah the rest of the year. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you don't need a mezuzah for the rest of the year. For those 7 days you have a mezuzah, but not the rest of the year. Fine. Rava says, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. If you're going to say that the reason that the Chacham require mezuzah the entire year is because since those 7 days of quarantine there needs to be a mezuzah, so therefore we have mezuzah the rest of the year, guess what? The rabbis say that on Sukkah, that your Sukkah doesn't need a mezuzah. And therefore I could argue that just like your Sukkah doesn't need a mezuzah, so the lishkas parhedrin shouldn't need a mezuzah for the week of quarantine. So rather, says Rava, everyone agrees that the rest of the year you do not need a mezuzah on the lishkas parhedrin. Rather, the machlokas is actually during that week itself. The rabbis say that you need a mezuzah for that week, and Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't need a mezuzah for that week. But didn't Rabbi Yehuda say that even your sukkah needs a mezuzah? So certainly the lishkas parhedrin should need a mezuzah? No, apples and oranges. Your sukkah needs a mezuzah according to Rabbi Yehuda because according to Rabbi Yehuda, a sukkah needs to be a diras keva, a permanent structure. The rabbis argue and say, no, a sukkah is a temporary dwelling, and therefore it doesn't need a mezuzah. When it comes to lishkas parhedrin, the Chachamim say that you need a mezuzah because dira bal korcha shmei dira, that living in a space against your will because you have to be there is nonetheless considered living there, and therefore you need a mezuzah. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says living in a space against your will is not considered actually living there, and therefore you would be pater from a mezuzah. Chaved, that was daf Yud. I hope you enjoyed it. Peace.